Mark Daniels. Now, Mark has developed a deep understanding of social enterprise through roles in government as a social enterprise manager and through his work with social traders, where he has been heavily involved in the development of Australian social enterprise sector. During his career, Mark has developed a suite of skills in areas of community building, employment innovation, management and policy, and program development. A constant emerging area of Mark's work has been social procurement as a tool for delivering goods and services as well as social impact. Mark is one of Australia's leading thinkers in social procurement, having been involved as a buyer and a seller via social enterprise, and over the last 6 years as an advocate and enabler for corporate and government buyers to socially procure from social enterprises. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please put your hands together for Mark Daniels. Thanks.
Thanks. Oh, I can see my slideshow. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I really just want to talk about social procurement, how it's progressing in Australia at the moment. This is based on something I did at a conference in Melbourne. Sorry, Kirsten. I know you've seen this, but I don't think anyone else has. I just want to talk about social procurement. You'll hear it a lot over the course of the day. I'm sure it's come up in your work if you run a social enterprise. It's a really simple concept. It's the concept of using your purchasing power to achieve social outcomes above and beyond the goods and services that you're buying. I might just go a bit handheld just a sec. I'll just ask. Can I use this? Yeah, go for it. All right. Yeah. No, that's good. So what we're really talking about in the broadest scheme of social procurement is not about just buying from social enterprises. You can actually buy from social enterprises, and we call a generic group as social benefit organisations, and they're businesses that exist to deliver some kind of benefit, or they're owned by a marginalised group. And then you've got private buyers who can also deliver social outcomes. So just to give you a sense, social benefit suppliers include fair trade organisations, social enterprises, Indigenous businesses, women-owned businesses, if that is an important element of the business to create to women's economic development. And then in terms of private businesses, what we are talking about is all sorts of private businesses, and they can all deliver social impacts as well as delivering business impact as well. I'm just going to keep moving through this. So when I'm talking about social procurement, there are three fundamental motivations in this. One is about keeping money in local economies. And what that means is if I'm buying from the local SME or the local social enterprise, I know that local people are going to get jobs, and that's a way of stimulating the local economy. If it's a disadvantaged community, that's going to be absolutely critical to the future job creation for those people. The second is around employment for marginalised groups. What that fundamentally means is that whoever the buyer is, they ostensibly want to create opportunities for people who wouldn't otherwise work. And social enterprises, more often than not, sit in this category. And the last one is around economic empowerment. And I guess what I mean by that is if you're the whole concept of women-owned business or Indigenous-owned business is that there isn't a high enough proportion of business going to women-owned businesses or Indigenous businesses in Australia. And that if you start to skew the procurement process, you can actually create opportunities for those communities to be more economically active, to create wealth in those communities as well. I'm just going to click through these. So I just want to focus on social enterprise now. I've given you a broad picture, and now I'm going to taper in. So I just want to talk about the way social procurement from social enterprise, so let me just call it social enterprise procurement, has changed in recent times. If I go back to 2005, and I was around working in this space in 2005, I think that the number of businesses and governments that deliberately bought from social enterprise was quite small. So social enterprises were winning work. They were usually winning work because they were really good and they won open tender processes. Or, RFTs, requests for tenders, RFQs, requests for quotes, whatever the normal process was. And so there were some really good examples. And, I've heard of examples of local governments who have been using social enterprises for 25 years based on handshake agreements because they believed in the value that they were creating particularly in the waste category. There's a whole range of social enterprise in that space. So there was a little bit going on, but not a lot. If you get to 2012, what we've seen in that 7-year period is a lot of growth. And we're starting to see some real pin-ups. And Gold Coast Council, I guess, is one that's widely understood and known as one who's really come to the fore. I think they're spending somewhere between 5 and 10 million a year, probably closer to 10 than 5. And they are constantly looking for new opportunities, and they want to fundamentally address disadvantage in their community and see social procurement as a vehicle for doing that. There are 2 other examples, and I'll touch on these a little bit later, but in New South Wales, there is actually exemptions to Australian disability enterprises having to go to tender for government works. So if someone in local government, someone in the state government in Queensland wants to get a disability enterprise to work for them, they simply have to go out to them, get a quote from them, and if it represents something like good value, i.e. within 10% of the range, that work can go to that organisation. And I guess the current state of play is that this is a really quickly emerging environment. What we're really seeing is a scaling up of social procurement, and it's happening quite quickly. You might not be experiencing it constantly, but it is happening quickly. We're seeing it rolling into government contracts. We're seeing it rolling into corporate thinking, and we've had some corporates here today. And I would estimate that, and local government is continuing to do more, and state governments and so forth. But the quantum is just growing. Now, 100 million isn't evenly distributed. It's not like 100 organisations are getting $1 million of work. There's probably 25 organisations that are benefiting the most from these sorts of opportunities. And you just heard from one when Luke was speaking at Toowoomba. So why the change? Well, basically, it's because if you go back in time, when procurement really came into being, which was, procurement's wasn't born in 96, but it really ramped up in 96 because governments started to outsource a whole range of functions that they used to do internally. Telstra outsourced stuff that it used to do internally. A whole range, and corporates started to outsource what they used to do internally. And they did it because they thought they could do it cheaper and with less risk, because suddenly there was a specialist company that just did construction. You didn't have public works departments all over the state or the country doing that sort of stuff. And what happened is our concept of value is changing. It's a very fluid idea. And you can think about that from your own perspective as a buyer. You value different things when you go and buy things. And procurement is changing over time. So around 2006, so 10 years later, we're seeing the environment being a big player in procurement. So people had to start to take consideration of environmental damage. And no one wanted to have slavery in their supply chain. So from around 2006, what we've seen is this growing awareness of supply chains, and companies like Nike and Walmart, and so many of them have had so much brand damage done by having slavery in their supply chains. So that changed as well. And I guess what we're seeing in 2016 is a whole range of factors that are starting to attach themselves to procurement. So you've still got environment and anti-slavery, but now you've got supply diversity, which means Indigenous businesses and women-owned businesses. You've got targeted employment, so people who want to get jobs for people exiting the manufacturing industry because Ford or Holden or whoever is closing down. We're seeing targeted jobs for long-term unemployed. We're seeing local content. So if you're in the Geelong region, where I'm from in Victoria, there are 21 organisations collectively committing $3 billion of spend to the local community. So they're choosing to buy local rather than from Melbourne and from other areas because they're about to lose Ford and they're about to lose Alcoa. And as far as they're concerned, this is the way to solve that economic challenge of having, 5,000 less jobs in the local community. If they buy local, they'll address that. And finally, social enterprise has become part of this dialogue as well. So this isn't exclusively about social enterprise, but it is very much about value changing, and we're seeing that shift, and it's quite significant. We don't know what it's going to look like, though, in the future. I guess I'm just saying with that red line, The underlying requirement is still price and risk management, but perhaps 5 to 10% of the procurement decision is now made up by the other factors as well. What does it look like in practice? Well, I mentioned before, there are businesses, the WA government, the New South Wales government has basically said, we will give preference, and in fact, we will directly allocate works to disability social enterprises. And what was interesting about that is they implemented a policy in 2009 and nothing changed, because policies actually don't mean anything unless there's execution attached to them. And so in 2012, they funded an internal position and a position working with the disability enterprises. And together, since 2012, they've created over $25 million in contracts and over 250 jobs for people with disabilities. So we're seeing some, really simple changes. They're still getting good value for money. They're just getting added value for money now. The other thing I just wanted to raise, and this is really important in the scheme of social enterprise procurement, is the federal government now has targets for Indigenous organisations. This really came out of the Forest Review, which basically said, how can we support Indigenous people? Well, we should buy from their businesses. So 3% of all procurement from the federal government will now go to Indigenous businesses. And in the first 12 months of that commitment, and it wasn't just a policy, it's being implemented and there are targets and so forth and processes. In the first 12 months, they spent $290 million with Indigenous-owned businesses in Australia. In 2014 and 15, they spent $5 million. Without a policy, they spent $5 million. With a policy, they spent $290 million. This year, they're intending to spend over $500 million with Indigenous businesses. And I guess the last thing in this thematic area is around this obsession with jobs that state governments have at the moment. Traditionally, the states would say it's the role of the Commonwealth to create employment. But in Victoria, New South Wales, and hopefully Queensland in the not too distant future, there is a really strong commitment to using infrastructure to create employment for marginalised groups. And so in Victoria, there's $25 billion of infrastructure in the next 10 years, and every contract they let must have social enterprises in their supply chain, which is profound and staggering. And in fact, if we had 1,000 social enterprises that could deliver into their supply chain, they'd soak up all of that demand. It's unlimited possibilities. The other government that's really driving some of this activity is the New South Wales government. So they've got $65 billion of infrastructure that they're going to build in Western Sydney. They're building a new airport, new roads, new train systems, and they're putting social procurement requirements into that, more around direct employment of disadvantaged people than social enterprise. And the Queensland government actually was developing a social procurement strategy, and I don't know where it is at this stage, so I can't give you a nice update, I'm afraid. South Australia is using their road contracts to create employment. They actually specify 20% of your employees must be people reskilling out of the manufacturing industry, long-term unemployed and Indigenous. And I'll give you percentages of the workforce that have to be made up of each of those cohorts. So I guess, we're seeing some really interesting government policy drivers behind this. And I guess the other thing that I just want to touch on, I don't know how well you can see it, but is that corporate Australia is all over this stuff. They're not coming into it really quickly. They're coming slowly and incrementally, and then they're being pushed by government to do this stuff as well. And what we found from corporates is that we did a survey of 30 corporates about 2 years ago. What we found was that at the time we did a survey, 11 of them were buying from social enterprises, 11 of 31. But by 2015, they said that 30 of the 31 wanted to be buying from social enterprises. So there's an enormous desire and intent in corporate Australia to buy from social enterprises. And they want to do it because of the shared value agenda, because of staff engagement, and because they want to build their brand, basically. This is a way of achieving brand building. And then they raised a range of issues that needed to be addressed. They said, we can't find social enterprises, so try and make it easy for us to find them. They said that we want directories, we want certification of social enterprises. How do we know that it really is a social enterprise and that they're a genuine business? And they said we want networking opportunities and we want training and support. And one of the things that we did off the back of that was we built a product called Connect. And Connect fundamentally exists to link certified social enterprises to businesses who want to buy from them. And so we've got 180 certified social enterprises, probably about 40 or 50 from Queensland. But I've taken material from everyone here, and if there's an opportunity, I'll look at if we can certify you. But we're working with a whole range of buyers, just to give you a sense. Some of them are household names, some of them are just massive companies you would never have heard of, like CPB, who is Leighton's and Tees, if you want to get a sense. Metro Trains in Melbourne, L'Oreal, you all know, I'm sure, particularly if you're female. ISPT is a massive property owner. Australia Post is a household name, so is AMP. We're working with the City of Melbourne, with two of the banks, Mirvac, Lendlease, and a couple of other punters as well. Just to give you a sense, their collective buying power is about $50 billion a year, and they're starting to look at how they can work with social enterprises. It's not actually a very quick process, though. Everything they do in their procurement teams is geared to getting the cheapest price as quickly as possible. And we're basically asking them to change who their suppliers are, to potentially change the processes that they access their suppliers with, which are all fundamentally risk-driven processes. And we're asking them to build social enterprise into their supply chain. And their CSR people are going, yes, yes, yes. And their senior management think this is great. But the procurement staff are interested, and then there are all these contract managers who are really difficult to influence, and we don't have direct contact with those people. So in the last 6 months, we've done about $4 million of deals through Connect. Access is probably the only one who's benefited from us in Queensland, although we may have put a few others forward. But we've created opportunities in New South Wales and Victoria. But basically, it's with the corporates. So wherever they want to buy from, that's where they're coming to us. And so we've got certified social enterprises everywhere. And I guess we see a massive opportunity for this stuff moving forward, because if we could do $4 million in 6 months on a program that's 12 months old, in 3 years, we would be thinking that we'd be doing $10 to $20 to $30 million a year through this sort of process, if the trajectory of interest in this stuff continues. But we think it could be bigger still. The other thing, and I'm almost at the end, is that there are, and this is some of the reasons why I believe there is $30, $50, $100 million a year of deals that could be done, is that there are two big organisations that I'm mentioning here. One is ISO, and I would say probably a third of the organisations in the room would have an ISO standard, a 9,000 or a 14,000 or whatever it is. If you work as a buyer, you're always looking for ISO. Well, ISO has decided to create a sustainable procurement guidelines, and that basically means that they're valuing social, environmental and ethical. And so for the first time, we're actually going to have the biggest buyers in the world starting to consider social in how they buy their goods and services. That's a game changer. There are 35 countries across the world who are working on those guidelines, and Social Traders is one of the organisations sitting on one of those panels. The other significant one here is a group called ISCA, and ISCA is the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. And you've never heard of it, and I've never heard of it until this year. But what ISCA does is they rate every major infrastructure project in the country. And they will tell you, if you're tendering, that you need to get an ISCA score of 70. So you need a 70 out of 100, and that's the level of sustainability that we require. And until this year, it just meant environmental sustainability. But ISCA's following ISO's lead, and they are basically saying sustainability is now social, ethical, and environmental. So you can actually be low on environmental and high on social and ethical and actually still meet your ISCA requirements moving forward. And I've just given you a sense. There's over $100 billion of infrastructure in the pipelines just in Victoria and New South Wales. I'm sure Queensland has its own major projects coming on as well. So as soon as it becomes normal for infrastructure buyers, as soon as it becomes normal through ISO for all the other buyers, we will start to see a shift in terms of how people engage with social enterprise. So what does the procurement future look like for social enterprise? I'm just building on the statistics that I had there before. You know, we don't think it's out of the realms that you could have, this is very pie in the sky, but $1 billion per annum by 2026. And I'll caution that. I mean, you know, it's probably a little ambitious, but you think about what happened in Indigenous procurement in 1 year. It went from $5 million to $270 million in 1 year. It's going to be over $500 million next year. We need, if government actually supports this, you will see this grow exponentially. And in Victoria, we're very optimistic that they are about to bring down a social procurement strategy across government. And that will pave the way for other states to follow on and start to build social enterprise into their supply chain. So we're pretty optimistic about the future and the possibilities. And I am going to stop on that note because I've probably run out of time. But I hope you found that useful. And I'm sure the slides will be in the public domain as well. Thanks very much.